Hello and welcome to section 6. Today we're going to look at what happens if we accept that pleasure is not synonymous with good. If you remember in our last video, Socrates argued certain things to prove that pleasure and good are not the same thing. If pleasure and distress can occur at the same time when someone is drinking a glass of water, because they can coexist simultaneously, that does not mean they are the same as good or bad, because good and bad are opposites and cannot exist together. That was the first conclusion made, and then from there he makes a conclusion about whether or not pleasure and distress can be used to say anything about whether or not a person is good or bad. And he says that it can't, because the person that experiences pleasure and pain could be a coward or they could be brave. And he even goes so far to say that if you accept that a coward would experience more pleasure if the enemy would retreat, and they experience more pleasure than the brave person if the enemy, they'll experience more distress than the brave person if the enemy advances. Even though they experience more distress, they are experiencing more pleasure, and consequently, if good and pleasure are the same thing, this means that the person is a better person than the brave man, and that's just not the case. Some flawed arguments, I think, making a lot of assumptions that need to be further proved and explored, and I don't think they are in the text, but that's where we're at in terms of the logic. So what do we do now with this conclusion that you can't use pleasure or pain to describe somebody as good? So therefore, pleasure does not equal good, and pleasure and distress can actually be used, can occur simultaneously, and consequently pleasure cannot be good and distress cannot be bad. What do we do with that? If good is not synonymous with pleasure, what do we do now? Okay. So we're going to summarize a section of the text that explore the consequences of not equating or good with pleasure. And we're going to outline some of the key premises that Socrates puts forward, because now it's time for Socrates to have his day. We're going to explore conclusions drawn by Socrates when he concludes that pleasure is not synonymous with good. And then we're going to outline the definitions of a healthy mind. Can you score yourself on these 3 success criteria? And once you've done that, you have an APK. I'll just type it out as we talk. Your APK is to draw a picture that represents a healthy mind. All right, that'll be great. Go for it. Okay, so at the end of the last section, Callicles is forced to concede something. Sometimes pleasures can be bad and sometimes pleasures can be good. Some pleasures are better than other pleasures. So you need to write that down. That is something that he definitely agrees with. And the way that we look at these pleasures, if they're good things, if they're a bad thing, is by thinking about the consequences and the rewards they have for the individual. So let's have a look. If the pleasure is overall beneficial for the individual, according to Callicles, and it has positive consequences in the future, then it is a good pleasure, right? If it is harmful for the individual and leads to really negative consequences in the future, then it is a negative pleasure. And of course, the goal would be to pursue as many positive pleasures to Callicles at this point in the argument. Take a note. So here we have a picture that kind of represents that. You want to maximize positive experiences that experience positive pleasures and minimize and completely minimize those negative experiences. Okay? You need to actively seek them out, just like you're going hunting. Now, to Socrates, he basically goes, okay, now let's look at this concept of good. I don't think you should be aiming for good pleasures. I think you should be aiming for the good, because the two are just not the same thing, right? Pleasure for good, not pleasure, not good for pleasure, okay? So the best pleasures that you should pursue are not necessarily good pleasures. They are pleasures that lead to something good, rather than experiencing good things for the sake of having pleasure. Take a note. That's what Socrates says. That's what you should be hunting for. That's really important. Okay. Right, so both say no negative pleasures. Do not engage in the binge eating of the cheeseburger because it will create an unhealthy body and unhealthy mind, even though it tastes absolutely fantastic. We can all relate to that kind of example, right? So the pleasure is not just for experiencing pleasure, it is to pursue something good in the long run because good is not the same as pleasure itself. Now, both Callicles and Socrates agree with this, and this is where they both agree that you need to find people who are knowledgeable and experts in finding the pleasures that lead to the good, right? So you need to look for the good pleasures. The good pleasures are the pleasures that seek and create good outcomes. And then this prompts Socrates to go, hey, do you remember when I was talking about the difference between a sham? I like calling it a sham, but he really calls them knacks. Shams or knacks are any kind of practices or anything that we do, procedures would be a good word for them, that allow us to perform some kind of flattery, but they don't actually achieve any good. We engage in them for the sake of flattery rather than for pursuing the real good. Whereas expertise, right, is when we actually do something that is concerned totally with the good. A good example would be cookery versus medicine. Cookery is designed to create food that tastes great, that flatters the senses, whereas medicine is designed, even if it doesn't taste good, but to produce a healthy body. All right. So that's a good kind of analogy to explore. Remember, anything that is about flattery is a knack, and anything that is about pursuing the true good is about expertise. So take some notes. So knowing this is what he's got everybody to recall, we kind of ask ourselves then this question. Now that we say that you can't just pursue pleasure, because not all pleasure is good for you. You have to pursue pleasure that actually allows you to achieve something good and has good consequences. You know, how should we live? How should we do this? How should we engage in that kind of lifestyle? And the answer is that we need to pursue procedures that allow the mind to uh, to do good things. All right. Now, of course, some procedures are bad and some procedures are good. He says we should totally reject any kind of procedures that are about pursuing pleasure for pleasure's sake or flattery. Nothing self-indulgent, I think, is the point that we really need to say. And examples of that would be singing, tragedy, um, music, and poetry. Now, we're from this point of view, we're basically at a point where Socrates asks him to outline, and this is how he kind of points it out, what I just said before. This is where he asks Callicles to talk about experiences that produce pleasure and also flatter people. And this is where basically Callicles says, oh, well, what about singing? What about tragedy? What about playing the reed pipe? And what about poetry? And all of these experiences are based on reward, and they're somewhat self-indulgent, right? But he believes they're about rewarding the mind. That's Callicles, right? And Socrates says, yeah, I don't know if they do reward the mind because, when you look at poetry, for instance, and you strip it back, you take away its rhythm, you take away its musical melodies, and you just leave the words, what you end up with is just public speaking with poetry. And public speaking is a form of rhetoric, it's a form of flattery. It doesn't really do good things for the mind, okay? Like here, Callicles is arguing that you have rewards for the mind when you engage in these different practices. But Socrates says, well, when you actually strip back one of those practices, which is poetry, and you have a look at what it is after you remove the rhythm and the music, it's just a form of public speaking. And the goal of public speaking is just to flatter and ingratiate the mind, right? And then Callicles goes, well, not all public speakers are bad. I don't know what you're complaining about. To which Socrates replies, yes, but the goal of public speaking is not what public speakers usually do. A public speaker should try and pursue good, and maybe any pleasure that you get from it is about pursuing the good, but the good comes first. And here we have a public speaker and we have a tradie. And what we're saying is if you're a good public speaker, You should be just like a good tradie, good tradesperson. And the fact is that you are aiming to produce something good, okay? Not trying to ingratiate the senses, not trying to make people feel good. You are trying to produce something that is actually good. So go through this and take some notes, right? Again, you need to look at procedures that are about the mind. Some procedures are good and bad. Callicles is asked about something that is self-indulgent or pleasurable and flattery. It involves flattering, sorry. And then he talks about music, tragedy, playing the reed pipe, and open poetry. And he says that all these things provide reward to the mind. But Socrates says, I don't know if they actually provide reward or flattery. Take a note. And he says, I don't know if they actually provide a reward. They just provide a false flattery. Because when you peel them back, what you find is poetry is nothing but public speaking, which is designed to flatter the mind, not actually provide it with truth. Take a note. Callicles is a bit offended, a bit upset, and says, hey, look, mister, they're not all bad. Have you heard about these public speakers? And then Socrates has a comment. He says, look, all right, the goal of public speaking is not necessarily what you talk about when you talk about your favorite public speakers. A good public speaker is like a philosopher. He aims to produce something good, create something good, just like a tradesman would. Now, Socrates then goes on to argue that you can't do this if you are in a poor state of health. You can only create something good if you have a good mind. And a good mind means you're aiming for the good, not for pleasure, but for the good, right? And that requires a degree of expertise, not some kind of flattery. And you can only achieve that degree of expertise if you have self-discipline and restraint. Okay? You need to take a note. So just like this guy performing a slide on the side plank, or is it a normal plank? His kind of behavior is about, doing something that might be initially painful, but overall it produces good outcomes. And you need that expertise in order to have a healthy mind and healthy body. You've got to have the same kind of disciplined approach to the mind. And that means that when you create something good through public speaking or through any of your actions, you're not engaged in flattery. You're not engaged in the knacks that Socrates said that you shouldn't be engaged in. Instead, you're about making other good minds, which means teaching people about truth and knowledge and philosophy. In fact, a good public speaker really is a good philosopher because he's focused on using his healthy mind to create other good minds. And that's where it finishes. So take some notes. Alrighty, so have we outlined key premises? We certainly have. Every time we've gone from different images and we've said these are the conclusions that he made from arguments from premises provided previously, we have outlined key premises. All right. Did we talk about the fact that, well, what would philosophy be like if pleasure was not synonymous with good? Well, yes, we did, because we know that the goal is to pursue pleasures that produce good outcomes. It could also be that you aim to or engage in behaviors that produce good outcomes as well. That means maybe some negative distress might be good, just like the guy doing the plank, as long as it produces good outcomes. Just like punishment of a person who's done something wrong produces good outcomes. It still is distress, but it still is necessary. So once you understand that the goal is to pursue practices that perceive good outcomes, you can also say a subset of that is the goal is to achieve, or the goal is to pursue pleasures that pursue good outcomes as well. Okay. And lastly, a definition of a healthy mind. Well, you should say it's a mind that can produce good things, and it's a mind that is engaged in expertise, not flattery, and it can only do that if it is restrained and disciplined. And hopefully your picture here that you drew for your APK reflects some of that. All right, that's the summary. Thanks.